Welcome to the OBSSR Director's webinar for February titled A Translational Journey from Basic Behavioral Science to Interventions for Addictive Behaviors. I'm Christine Hunter, the Deputy Director of the Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research at the National Institutes of Health. We have a special guest moderator with us today, and before I introduce her, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping items. I want to remind you that today's webinar is being recorded, and that recording will be available on the OBSSR website in approximately 1 month. Today's presentation will be followed by a question and answer session. During the webinar, all lines will be muted. Questions and comments will not be taken via phone, but you can submit your questions using the Q&A feature on WebEx. To ask questions or send us a comment, click on Q&A on your screen and select Ask All Panelists, and then you just type in your question and hit send. Our moderator will facilitate the question and answer session by reading the questions you send aloud to the speakers. Feel free to send a question at any time during the webinar. Questions will be asked following the presentation. And in terms of the moderator, we're very pleased to have Dr. Susan Czikowski join us today. Susan is Chief of the Health Behaviors Research Branch at the National Cancer Institute. She's an expert on psychosocial and behavioral risk factors for disease, including the development and testing of interventions for behavioral risk factors such as obesity, physical inactivity, adverse diets, and non-adherence to medical regimens. She also focuses on the roles of social support and depression in disease risk and recovery, and the assessment of health-related quality of life and psychosocial functioning in patients with chronic disease. Thanks for joining us today, Susan.
Thank you, Christine, for the introduction. And as Christine mentioned, I'll be moderating today's webinar, and there will be a question and answer session following today's presentation. I'll be facilitating that by asking your questions aloud to our guest presenters. Our webinar today explores how basic behavioral scientists and those doing more applied or clinical research can develop collaborations that lead to the development of novel and potentially more effective behavior change interventions. Enhancing the translation of basic to clinical research in the behavioral sciences is currently a topic of great interest within NIH, and there are a number of initiatives in recent years that many of you may have heard of that are intended to bridge that gap between basic and clinical behavioral science. The Science of Behavior Change Common Fund Initiative, or SOBC, and the Obesity-Related Behavioral Intervention Trials, or ORBIT RFA program, are just two examples within a series of NIH-funded programs that attempt to foster an integration between basic and clinical behavioral science research to bring new discoveries in the behavioral sciences to bear on difficult behavioral health problems. But the question is, beyond developing specific funding opportunities to stimulate such integrative research, how do we facilitate the interaction of basic and clinical behavioral researchers on a more long-term, sustainable basis? Perhaps by understanding how the translational journey from basic to applied research occurs naturally, we can design structures and processes that foster these kinds of collaborative endeavors. And that is precisely the idea behind today's webinar. Joining us to describe their research collaboration, which spans basic and applied domains, are Dr. Warren Bickel and Dr. Sam McClure. Dr. Bickel is Virginia Tech Carilion Inaugural Professor of Behavioral Health Research. He's an accomplished scholar and researcher in addiction and health behavior research. He received his Ph.D. in developmental and child psychology from the University of Kansas and completed postdoctoral training at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Dr. Bickel has led research programs at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, the University of Vermont, and the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences. He currently leads NIH-funded research programs at the Virginia Tech Carilion Research Institute. He's the recipient of numerous awards and honors, including the 2016 Nathan B. Eddy Award for Outstanding Research. Dr. Bickel has co-edited 5 books. He's published over 400 papers and chapters, and his work is frequently cited and receives national and international recognition. Also joining us is Dr. Samuel McClure. Dr. McClure is an associate professor of psychology at Arizona State University. He completed his Ph.D. in neuroscience at Baylor College of Medicine before working as a postdoctoral fellow in the psychology department at Princeton University. Prior to moving to Arizona State, Dr. McClure was an assistant professor of psychology at Stanford University, and his research blends computational modeling with behavioral and neuroimaging methods to study reward processing and decision-making in people. He performed some of the initial research showing that reward learning signals can be tracked in people using fMRI. A large component of his research has investigated how impulsivity arises from the interaction of brain reward systems with executive control processes. Dr. McClure has enjoyed a long-standing collaboration with Dr. Bickel, in which the two have applied some of Dr. McClure's findings on the neural and behavioral basis of impulsivity to clinical self-control disorders. And we'll now hear about how this translational journey, this long collaborative endeavor, began and progressed over a number of years. And we'll also hear about the lessons these researchers have taken away about how to build and nurture the basic to clinical research pipeline in order to better address addictive and other problematic health behaviors. So we'll begin with Dr. Bickel.
Great. Thank you, Susan. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time out of their busy day to come and see this webinar and participate in this webinar. And it's a real pleasure for me to share some of our work. We're going to start with this quote from Einstein: "To raise new questions, new possibilities, to regard old problems from a new angle and requires creative, imaginative, and marks real advance in science." Well, we're going to tell you how new ideas came forward for us. This is work that we put, this slide's the deck we put together with a friend and collaborator, Gregory Madden at Utah State University. And we're going to talk about 5 maxims for achieving innovative ideas in cross-disciplinary translational health behavior research. So a key part of this is going to be the concept of temporal discounting. And at first I'd like to just make sure everyone understands that so that when we go forward into the maxims, you can follow along. Temporal discounting says as the interval between response and outcome increases, the value of the outcome declines. So let's consider you want to get some coffee in the morning. And on one set of conditions, you can go walk right up to the counter and make your purchase. We can see that on this plot of value versus delay, you don't have really a delay and you value it a whole bunch. But what if there are a couple people in front of you? What if there's actually a longer line? Well, that's going to reach the point where you say, well, I don't really value waiting in that humongous line for coffee. Maybe I'll go somewhere else, right? The outcome becomes too delayed and it loses value. This function that we have plotted there is a hyperbolic function, and it seems to describe how people deal with things that are delayed in time. And one of the first empirical studies of that was demonstrated by Howie Racklin and colleagues, and they were looking at people discounting what I'm sure was a hypothetical $1,000 as a function of different delays, and you see this sort of hyperbolic function. So that sort of is the concept of delay discounting, right? Things that are delayed lose value. The same thing as it comes closer has more value. So B.F. Skinner, in his classic 1956 paper, A Case History of the Scientific Method, had a series of maxims. such as, when you run into something interesting, drop everything else and study it. That's something I still quote to my trainees today. Another one is some ways of doing research are easier than others. Well, we took the impetus from B.F. Skinner and have come up with our own maxims that we think illustrates how our collaboration has come together. So, maxim 1, surround yourself with smart people and read science outside your research area. So, in 1996, when I was at the University of Vermont, I and several of my postdocs, we were in a brew pub. And they're really smart people. This is Greg Madden, Utah State University, Nancy Petrie, University of Connecticut Health Science Center, and John Roll at the University of Montana. And we were drinking beer, but we were there because we wanted to read outside our research area. We were reading this text, Economic Choice Theory, an experimental analysis of animal behavior. And in there, they describe this temporal discounting phenomenon, sometimes called delay discounting. In economics, it's called time preference. And we said, well, we should check this out and see how this works in the populations that we were working with. So when you run into something interesting, well, we didn't drop everything else because we had active grants, but we definitely studied it and pursued it. And here's our first paper in that regard, where we looked at discounting in opioid-dependent individuals versus control participants, discounting hypothetical money or hypothetical drug. And here's the data from that. And what you see is each of those, the way that we do this task is we ask individuals to make choices. What would you prefer, let us say, for example, $1,000 now or $1,000 a month from now? Well, if it's the same $1,000, why would you wait a month to receive it? But then we ask, what about $950 now versus $1,000 a month from now? $900 now versus $1,000 a month from now. If you switch your preference when you reach $800 in the immediate amount, and you switch to the larger later amount, we can infer that you discount $1,000 by 20%. If we do this at a variety of different time frames, 1 week, 1 month, 6 months, a year, and so forth, we can construct a curve. And the closer that individuals hug the axes, the greater the discounting. So you can see in the upper panel that opioid-dependent individuals who are discounting the same amount of money as controls discount substantially more than controls. You can ask the question, how much more? And one way we quantitate these curves is by this notion of half-life. How long does it take for this hypothetical $1,000 to lose half its value? And I don't know if you can see my cursor on the screen. I hope you can. But the one that's above, like around 60 for the controls, that's about it's a little less than the halfway point, but we'll take it as a point of convenience. That's the 5-year time frame. And for the opioid-dependent people, it's right on here, and that's a 6-month time frame. That's a 10-fold difference in how they discount. We then asked the heroin-dependent individuals to discount $1,000 worth of heroin, and then we brought down their money curve. So this is their money curve from the above plot, and this is how they discount heroin. And you can see that they are hugging the axes extremely, and at the shortest time frame examined, it never got to 50%. There was no amount of heroin today that was worth any amount of heroin to tomorrow. That means there was a greater than a 25-fold difference between how they discounted heroin and how they discounted money, or if we're comparing the discounting of heroin by heroin-dependent individuals to the equivalent monetary amount among controls, we're talking in excess of a 250-fold difference. When you get those sort of differences in science, you think, there's something interesting here. And then we started getting really busy. So we started doing a variety of studies, started thinking about it really hard, started examining in different groups, and that resulted into new discoveries. Lo and behold, virtually every form of illicit drug use and abuse results in excessive discounting of the future. Same for illicit drugs. same for substance use. People that use multiple substances discount more than people that use single substances. We found that people that engage in high-risk behaviors discount more than those who do not. And this is both referring to risky sexual behavior as well as using injection equipment to get high. James McClure, a wonderful investigator who's in this area, did a meta-analysis and showed that it's pervasive in addictive disorders. And there's a lot of evidence that people with obesity excessively discount the future. And so much so that we have argued that it's a trans-disease process. Now, over the duration of time that we've been doing this, more and more people have been getting involved, and here's a plot from PubMed, just putting in the word delay discounting, which may exclude some of the other names it goes by. And what you see is there's really a lot of interest and a lot of activity by investigators exploring this concept. We've also argued that discounting should be a behavioral marker for the entire addiction process, starting with identifying who would later become addicted. It's a heritable, stable trait. There are longitudinal studies, as I sort of referred to briefly before, that you can measure people at one point in time and then see if they get involved in substances or other challenging circumstances, and discounting seems to be predictive of that. There's even there's a lot of preclinical work that sort of maps on very nicely. So, Marilyn Carroll at the University of Minnesota and others have examined the acquisition of cocaine self-administration in rats. But first they measure how much they discount the future, and then they look at how quickly they acquire cocaine self-administration. And the animals who discounted the future substantially, here indicated by the high impulsivity, acquired cocaine self-administration much quicker than the group that had low impulsivity or valued the future significantly more. And the extent of discounting is proportional to drug use. The more drug you use, the more you discount. The more obese you are, the more you discount. And interestingly enough, if you measure it at baseline and people go into a treatment, it's predictive of therapeutic outcome. The people that value the future the most do the best in treatment. People are starting to recognize that it should be used as a screening tool. At this point, we jump into the next maxim that Sam will carry forward.
So, hello everyone. The maxim, so I think Warren did a great job of laying out, so temporal discounting is clinically really relevant behavior, and the question then becomes, where does it emerge from? Why are there these differences between drug-dependent or drug users and control subjects? And the way we ended up coming together is because we came from very different disciplines and we sort of intersected somewhere in the middle. And the discipline that I came from was neuroscience, and I was a graduate student in the mid-90s when this new technique emerged, which is functional magnetic resonance imaging. And this led to a series of discoveries, which I'm going to describe relatively briefly, that it started to intersect with the type of work that Warren does. So this is just a picture. I think you all know this is an fMRI scanner, but this is actually a study that I ran as a grad student. You can see these tubes coming out of the scanner that's dropping down at the end of the bed. These are tubes that carry juice, and we were replicating studies in monkeys looking at basic reward processes. And in monkeys, you make them water deprived, and then you give them juicy juice to make them to motivate them. We basically did the same thing. We had people not drink for a long period of time, and then they do a task in the scanner. We'd study brain reward processes. So, Warren, if you go to the next slide. The findings in the monkeys that we're trying to replicate were based on the function of midbrain dopamine neurons, which are really critical for basic motivational processes, but they're also the brain systems that are the targets of drugs and abuse. And it had been shown by Wolfram Schultz and colleagues that response of these neurons tracks rewards and signals are related to the prediction of reward. So if there's some cue that tells you that there's a reward coming in your future, then these dopamine neurons learn that these cues have predictive accuracy, and they respond to these cues. So it's not worth going into the details in the slide, but what this is basically what it shows is that if there's ever a predictive cue, a conditioned stimulus that predicts a future reward, then the responses of these dopamine neurons to that cue scale in proportion to the size of the subjective value, actually, of that delayed reward. So we were interested in testing whether we can actually find similar processes in humans. And the next slide shows the results of that, which is if we take these humans, we treat them like monkeys and we stick them in a scanner, and basically, a modern Skinner box, and then we give them squirts of juice following a predictive cue, then we can replicate these basic signals that are identified in monkeys. So this is basically the same as on the previous slide, which I didn't go into on the details. But the critical thing here is that you can take basic neuroscience findings from animals, translate them up to humans, and then now measure these basic motivational processes. The brain structures are a little bit different. This is measuring from a structure called the nucleus accumbens, where you see that it responds to rewards and based on their predictability. But we've now followed up and we've looked down at the same brainstem nuclei that they record from in monkeys, and you see the same signals there. The cool thing about this is that it gives you a direct way to tap in directly to basic motivational systems in people and record from them directly. It's an indirect measure because you're looking at blood flow, but in simplified behavioral paradigms, the signal tracks pretty well with what we know about the dopamine system, and people have now used this same measurement technique, and we have too, to look at learning processes and decision-making processes. So you can predict simple decisions about relative value based on looking at these signals, and you can track how people are learning the value of different cues in the world using this same technique. Okay, so next slide. At this point, so this is just sort of more biographical, but I graduated, finished my Ph.D. doing those basic studies, and then I was interested in sort of trying to look at more interesting behavior. And the behavior that I became interested in was temporal discounting. And I think this is another principle, another maxim that Warren highlighted, but we don't have as a maxim, which is, he was in a brew pub with beer and smart people talking about areas of science outside their expertise. This project came about because I was at a conference for a new field, what's called neuroeconomics, with people outside my field, economists, probably also drinking beer. I don't think that's really accidental. You need food and beer to sort of stimulate interesting discussions like this. But we were talking to economists, and we realized that there were models in economics that looked like they may make predictions about brain activity. In particular, the hypothesis from economics was that the hyperbolic shape of discounting really emerges from two separate evaluative systems. One is sort of really myopic, it cares about satisfying immediate needs, and the other is this more reflective, deliberative, executive control related kind of process, whereas if you're trying to plan for the future and guide your behavior based on long-term goals, then that has a much more modest rate of time discounting than something that's really emotionally driven and myopic. This sounded a lot to us. We were sitting around talking to these economists. It sounded a lot to us like what we know about brain systems. So we knew about these basic motivational systems, which are very myopic, conserved in humans and mice and monkeys. But then we also know that people have the ability to plan and make goals for their future, and that this relies on the prefrontal cortex, which is really critical for future goal planning and goal maintenance. The economic models, which is sort of shown on the left, is not really worth going into, but they make specific predictions about the relative contributions of these two systems, and they show that you can account for a lot of the behavioral results in time discounting by assuming these kind of this interaction of multiple systems. So that became our motivating hypothesis, is that the discounting curves that Warren showed you at the beginning actually emerged from the interaction of two brain systems. So in the next slide, it showed you just the first experiment we ran with these economists looking at testing whether we can identify these different brain systems. We basically just changed the time to reward, and we made predictions based on this mathematical model about how the different brain systems should track the time at which rewards were available. And we were able to find exactly what we were hoping for, that these basic reward systems shown on the top set of brain slices, nucleus accumbens, the medial prefrontal cortex, orbital frontal cortex, they show really strong time dependence. So if you delay reward at all, they basically stop responding. Whereas these brain systems in the prefrontal cortex and parietal cortex, those brain slices on the bottom, they are much less sensitive to time. They're from other work, we know they're involved in executive processes. And then on the right, we call them beta and delta areas based on these economic models. We're able to predict choices and based on relative activity of these two systems. So if you're dealing with an immediate versus delayed reward, you can do a pretty good job of predicting your choice outcome based on relative activity of these two systems. We've since followed up, so this is from 2004, but of the past way too many years, I've been tracking these systems and trying to make predictions. We can do all sorts of interesting individual differences measurements now, looking at tractography and brain maturation through adolescence, and show that you can predict differences in overall levels of impulsivity based on knowing about these systems and their interconnectedness through frontal striatal projections. The critical thing is that for this talk is that Warren became aware of this work and realized that it was directly related to what he was interested in, which is why is it that drug abuse is associated with different levels of delay discounting. And identifying these two systems and pointing out their cognitive bases led to a whole new set of hypotheses, which is on the next slide, which is that if you know that these systems exist, they suggest cognitive processes may give rise to different levels of discounting, and there are really two sort of sets of ways, two ways in which you could become more impulsive. One is that you have greater dependence on these basic limbic reward systems that are dependent on the doping system. And the other is that you have an insufficiently active cognitive control or executive cortex system. Either of these two things can go wrong, but they lead to two different pathways by which you may have different levels of time discounting that underlies addiction. Warren, do you want to take over here?
Yes, absolutely. So I just want everyone to understand. So I was studying this delay discounting thing for like nearly 10 years, and then Sand published the data he just talked to you about in Science in 2004, and it was like a light bulb went in my head. I finally understood what I was studying, and I'm so glad I learned it because it allowed us to start thinking about things. So if we think about this dual decision system presented here, and that discounting summarizes the relative control of those two systems, it allows us to think about certain things. So let's think about what would it be like if somebody was generally in good health and had balance between these two decision systems. Well, one would expect that you could either discount a lot or little or in between, because you have the full range of all these capacities, right? So if I'm walking down the street and someone comes after me with a knife, it'd be good if I could focus on the next couple of minutes. Conversely, when I'm signing up for retirement benefits, it'd be great if I'm thinking about the long term, and probably for many other things it's in between. While if we're talking about somebody with an addiction, or perhaps some of the other disorders that fit with excessive discounting of the future, such as obesity or type 2 diabetes, it would suggest that there may be some constraint on these systems working together, and they'd be less flexible. So here is some data from my laboratory, and we're looking at control participants in the upper left panel, recreational cocaine users in the upper right panel, and chronic cocaine users in the lower left panel. Each of those lines are discounting something different. We don't have the time or the energy to go through it right now, but with the key observation is you see the control participants can either discount a lot or a little or in between. When the recreational cocaine users are faced with the same thing, there's that range diminishes and starts to move a little bit down. And when we get to the chronic cocaine users, these different things are right on top of each other and are associated with generally more discounting, right? So here's some evidence that flows directly from this idea of this dual decision system, or as I like to call it, the competing neurobehavioral decision system. If you have, as you move through addiction, in a real sense, the range by which you can bring to, of how you consider the future that you bring to circumstances becomes progressively more restricted, and you lose the ability to either discount a lot or little depending on the needs of the circumstances. You end up just discounting a lot. Now, this then, you know, the beauty of a dual decision system, it says, well, we have different ways that we can try to push it around, right? So we can either try to improve the executive system or decrease the impulsive decision system. And this leads to our next maxim, maxim number 4. If you want truly to understand something, try to change it. It was a wonderful quote by Kurt Lewin. And indeed, when we started to changing it, I think we learned some important things. But prior to having this dual decision model, I couldn't think of how to change it. So we came across this quote from Kurt Vonnegut, Slaughterhouse-Five. The book was Maniacs in the Fourth Dimension by Kilgore-Trout. It was about people whose mental diseases couldn't be treated because the causes were all in the fourth dimension, time. Three-dimensional earth doctors, like myself, couldn't see all those causes or even imagine them. But then a group that I'm pleased to say are my collaborators I interact with, LAN Epstein up at the University of Buffalo, published this paper. The future is now reducing impulsivity and energy intake using episodic future thinking. Using the relatively new science of prospection, he had people think about several future events at a rate in time where they tried to make those events really concrete. For example, we might, in that study or in the studies that we use with it, we might ask people to tell me something that you're going to be doing a week from now. Tell me who's going to be there, what's going to feel like, what are you going to see, hear, smell, and let's give me a name of it, right? It might be going to like a nephew's birthday party, and tell me something at a month. Tell me something at 6 months. Tell me something at a year. And you make those events concrete. You develop cues for them, and when they're doing tasks, you flash up the cues or the control tasks, which is often episodic recent thinking, things that happened to you over the last 24 hours. And we found some interesting results. In cigarette smokers, we got them to value the future more. So this is the discounting curve where we put the delays in log just so they'll be clearer to see. Otherwise, it would look more like that hyperbolic function. But anyway, you can see that when they're under the influence of episodic future thinking, they value the future more. If we look at area under the curve, they value the future more. More than that, when we do a hypothetical cigarette purchase test with them, we say, how many cigarettes would you buy at these different prices for your consumption over 24 hours? Can't give any away or save any. And we take this as a measure of how much they value their cigarettes. In the presence of the episodic future events relative to the control events, it decreases how much they value cigarettes. We then did a very interesting test. We recorded them talking about the episodic future events or the control events. We got these cigarette smokers to be cigarette deprived and then put them in a room where they had free access to cigarettes for an hour, and we pumped in over audio them talking about the future events or the control events. And when we did that, they actually smoked less when they're in the presence of them talking about the future, despite the fact that they're cigarette deprived and have complete free access to cigarettes. I would presume they're going to smoke to satiation, but indeed, under the future events, they smoke fewer number of puffs. And that's just a replication of that. So we did the same thing in alcohol dependence, and we got alcohol-dependent individuals to value the future more. We then did the alcohol purchase task, and we got them, and in the presence of the episodic future events, it decreased their valuation of alcohol. In a project, Ensley project that LAN Epstein and I have with the SOBC project that Susan mentioned, we looked at episodic future thinking in the obese, and when we got them to got the obese to do it, they ended up discounting less relative to the control group, and we also had a just measured discounting in obese individuals, and that looked just like the control group, which is nice. Then we had them engage in the purchase test for their favorite food item, and lo and behold, episodic future thinking got them to value their favorite food item less. Now, all this work led me to come up with a new idea to think about the processes involved that result in addiction and obesity and perhaps some of these other disorders, which I call, and several other people like LAN Epstein also call, reinforcer pathology. And one of the key things that we're saying with this is that reinforcers are integrated over a window, right? So we all experience this, right? Some of us may have a big breakfast one day. Well, then we tend to have a smaller lunch. Somehow we're integrating those events over time. And we're suggesting that delayed discounting is, in fact, a measure of this temporal window of integration. Interestingly enough, there is no theory of addiction out there that refers to a temporal window of integration. And this new theory that we're actually working on a paper to describe in detail will be the first one that does that. Now, what it says is, let's think just about the nature of like drug reinforcers or food reinforcers versus pro-social reinforcers like employment or jobs, which at least among the addicted, as they become more and more addicted, it seems that those reinforcers, those pro-social reinforcers, lose their value. Well, drug reinforcers are brief, intense, and reliable. They have a particular sort of pharmacodynamic profile, rapid change in state, and then a somewhat slower and gradual decline in state, but still pretty quick. And you can think of all the reinforcers that people get in trouble with: drugs, food, sex, gambling. They have that brief, intense, reliable characteristic, at least gambling when you win, not necessarily when you lose. And think about pro-social reinforcers, so like relationships or employment. They are lower intensity, variable in nature, and if we can see them over a long temporal window, they have value. So for example, right, employment, I have a good day at work, a bad day at work, okay day at work. Now imagine you have a choice between drugs and going to spend time with your significant other, but you got a short window of time, a short temporal window of integration by which you're evaluating these reinforcers. Which one are you going to select? Well, the brief, intense, reliable one, or the variable one that is lower intensity, and you can only see it over a short period of time, not over the longer period of time, and your significant other is probably displeased with you anyhow because you've been getting high too much. So it's clear how that would shift those preferences. And what we're thinking is, with this reinforcer pathology model, by expanding the temporal window, we're allowing the influence of other reinforcers to come in, those extended pro-social reinforcers, and compete with the drug reinforcer, which in turn dampens its value. We are in process of developing a measure of the extended prosocial reinforcement process, which would then allow us to have a complete model of this process. And we're working on it vigorously. And if it shows, if those measures of the prosocial reinforcer operate in an inverse direction relative to drugs, for example, when we increase and decrease that temporal window, that would be remarkable. We'd have a complete system that we could describe. Let us jump to the next maxim. Sam, you want to bring us home?
No, I wasn't prepared for that. But I think you should do it, Warren.
Okay. So maxim 5, the best way to predict the future is to invent it. Alan Kay said that. And what we think, right, is, so for researchers, you know, this is just, you know, you saw a little bit of case study of Sam and I's work, but reading outside the field, attending new conferences, finding new collaborators is a wonderful way to come across new ideas. One of the things I tell my trainees, particularly those focused on addiction science, is if all you read is addiction science, it's not going to be helpful, because if the answer was currently in addiction science, we'd have the problem solved. The answer is going to come from reading, finding some idea that addiction science has yet to incorporate. And of course, you need to find a way to stick with it despite what others may say. And in my own personal experience, when I started doing sort of behavioral economic work, which I consider some of this the latest counting stuff, but some other work as well, I had people come up and tell me that it's going to hurt my career if I did it, but the data was so orderly and so meaningful, and I stuck with it despite from counsel, from others saying don't do it. And when I was writing a competing continuation for one of my grants for the National Institute of Drug Abuse, they deemed it a merit award, method to extend research in time award, and gave me 10 years of funding. So thank goodness I was persistent and didn't just like give up because people didn't like it at the time. I think science. So
Warren, oh sorry. Oh sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, when we first were talking with Susan and others about these, you know, about these ideas, this persistence idea really emerged at the fore. It's because, Warren, you and I both had the same experiences. Once you start doing something new and start reading outside of areas and start trying to bridge ideas and incorporate them into your thinking about a problem, there's all sorts of resistance to it. I received very similar warnings to Warren, saying that I was basically lampooning any possible future I would have. And you know, it's really hard to know how to deal with this problem, sort of from a structural standpoint, because I mean, you'd like to encourage people to reach out across disciplinary boundaries, because that's really where a lot of big advances, big jumps come from. But you know, really, it's just, yeah, it would be really interesting to come up with a structural way to solve those issues. Yeah.
Absolutely. And we think that science leaders, administrators should support innovative interdisciplinary meetings to enhance cross-fertilization and provide support for novel ideas. One thing that just happened to me that came directly from this work, today I was emailed by someone in the White House, and they would like me to come down next Tuesday to talk to them about decision-making processes in addiction. This is to address the opioid problem. And I'm pleased to have that opportunity to share the science with them and hope that it somehow impacts their decision-making processes when they think about the problem of addiction. But, you know, here's an incident or an example of where this work is finally coming to the attention of other people, and they're finding it of value and want to understand it. So I think when you find something that makes sense, where you find things that have big effects, when you have things that are new, don't give up. Just keep on pursuing it. So I think that probably concludes our presentation, and we'd be pleased to, Sam and I, to answer any questions that individuals may have.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bickel and Dr. McClure. It was really, really informative and interesting presentation. And we'll now go ahead and begin the question and answer session. Just like to remind the audience to ask a question or to send us a comment. Click on Q&A on the screen, select Ask All Panelists, and type in your question and then hit Send. So we don't have any questions right now. I think I'll begin with just something that is of interest to me and that I'd like to know. I thought your suggestions, your maxims throughout were just fantastic, and especially including recommendations. But I have a question, which is you say people should read outside their area of expertise, read, study, interact with other people who are not within your area of study, and obviously you all did that and really had some very good experiences from it. But often people, especially folks, let's say clinically oriented folks who are not as aware of and kind of versed in the basic sciences, basic behavioral sciences, or basic scientists who are not as versed in clinical topics, there may be a reluctance, you know, to kind of reach out to others in different fields. So I guess my question is, you know, how do you encourage people to move outside their comfort zones? There is something about staying within your area, you know all about it, you know the most about it, and people sometimes are shy or it's very difficult to think about, you know, moving outside that comfort zone, as they say. Are there training issues here? Are there other kinds of issues that we could look at? I guess I would ask you that.
Well, you know, so I think there's utility in having exposure to a lot of ideas during training, for sure. I know that Len, and I've adopted it from LAN Epstein. He has an idea playground where he and his trainees go find an idea that's outside of the field and just present it and talk about how it may be related. Now, a lot of times I'm sure that doesn't lead to anything, but at least it builds a repertoire of looking for new ideas and thinking about how they could be relevant to the problem that you're focused on. I think that's an interesting training for people that are already, you know, well established in their field. I think it's a matter of making it part of the discipline, right? So one thing that we're good in science is being disciplined about doing things that, you know, at times are challenging, like writing grants for deadlines, and making some time to just explore some literature, I think, could be a helpful process, even if, you know, so one of the interesting things, like with discounting, you know, I was interested in discounting, but I just didn't read it in addiction. I read it wherever it showed its face, and it showed up in obesity, and that opened some doors for me. And I, of course, ran into Sam's work. That's why I call Sam's work my Rosetta Stone, because it taught me what I was need to know about my field, but it wasn't directly in my field. So there could be ways that if you just pursue like a process that has broader generality than a disorder, that you could find ways to look at it. Sam, you have any further thoughts?
No, I always think that one of the big problems is well, there are a couple. There's a structural thing, which is that you need to be an expert in a field in order to have a scientific career. So you need to get hired by a department into an area and then be a recognized expert in an area. And if you sort of float between disciplines, that's a challenge. So that's something that's talked about at universities a lot. The other one that comes to mind is just the you know, the willingness to be ignorant. You know, you go through all this training and you're an expert in a field, and then all of a sudden you got to start reading a whole new literature and read terminology and that you don't understand. And I think it takes a special person to be able to just embrace that ignorance and power through it and discover, you know, any possible value to you on the other end. You agree with that, Warren?
Absolutely. I'm so ignorant about so many things, and I'm grateful for it because it gives me a chance to learn.
Yeah, no, that's a unique capacity, I think.
Yeah, I think
rare capacity.
Absolutely. Some people want to stay in the safe territory. You have to, I guess, be prepared to, you know, risk energy, risk potential resources if you want to try to do something new. But one thing that's helpful is the fact that NIH measures innovation as one of its key variables of grant writing or grant applications, and hopefully this side of the idea would feed very nicely into that.
Great. Thank you. We are getting some questions, so why don't I read through a few of those. One says that Warren mentioned getting a call from the White House to go and share his knowledge on opioid addiction, and this individual wants to learn more about how scientific findings can impact policy making, if at all. I don't know if either of you want to take that one.
Well, we're going to have to see how it goes.
How do you imagine your work might impact some of the policy?
Sorry. Well, I mean, so part of it's just doing the work and making sure it gets recognized. So I've had a couple students who have gone into public policy. So one worked for the White House for a number of years, and she took basic behavioral science findings. This was with Obama, and she applied them and made a number of important advances. I had another student who's now works for the city of San Francisco developing drug policy, and he emails me on occasion and talks about these ideas that we've been talking about today and like how valuable they are in writing these white papers for the mayor of San Francisco. So part of it is just having access, and part of it's doing it, and part of it I think is just being visible, and then having them call you, right?
Yeah. I didn't call them; they called me.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, great. We have another question, a graduate student who asks, can you talk a little bit about future directions and what areas still need to be addressed? So is there anything even beyond what you've talked about here that is on the horizon that you're thinking about?
So we're trying to figure out how to move this episode of future thinking into treatment programs and how it could interact with other types of interventions, including transcranial magnetic stimulation. Could that make these type of things stronger? Or actually, in a project that's ongoing right now, we're looking at can we use real-time fMRI neurofeedback? This is with my collaborator, Stephen LeConte at Virginia Tech. Can we use real-time neurofeedback in these fMRI magnets to build, to strengthen and develop consideration of the future in drug-dependent people?
Wow.
I guess I'll give a different answer. I don't know, maybe it's more pessimistic, but, one weird thing about this, talking about this with Warren is, it's like a success case, like things we did worked and it turned out that they blossomed, right? So you start with an idea in a brew pub in Vermont, and it turns out that blossoms into a 20-year career, and the chances of that happening are small, I would guess. But you have to, I think one thing I always try to remind myself is it's okay to fail, just to try to do it quickly and move on. When you see something works, like Warren said, you hone in. So it's hard to know exactly what the future will be. You've got to make guesses and try, and developing new interventions based on ideas and brain stimulation techniques, and looking at adolescence and development as an important time for, these are I think our guesses for what the future is, but hopefully, Warren, we'll try, and some of them will work, some will fail, and we'll just keep plowing ahead. Is that Fair?
Yeah, I think, well, absolutely. When you're trying new things, right, you have to, what you don't want to do is say, I'm just going to try one thing. You want to try a lot of things. And well, actually, one of the things I think a lot about is a scientific career. You know, there's a lot of ways one could have a scientific career. I know some people who just like pick one thing, and I said they're just going to drill on it down, and more power to them. I like the idea of having a portfolio of a couple things that I'm interested in, because that way if something goes south, I'm not like standing by myself saying, oh my goodness, what will I do now? You know, I have other things that hopefully are going well also.
Great. Well, another question here. Thank you for this very interesting and important work. Especially when taking the more assertive view of reinforcer pathology, it appears to assume that the short and long-term reinforcers are necessarily oppositional in goals and outcomes. Can you expand?
Sure. So, as I mentioned about, like, if you're in health and you can have short-term goals and long-term goals, I think it's okay to have short-term events, right? So the question is, does one crowd out the other? And I think as a function of one's temporal window of integration and how much you discount the future. But as you start shortening your window, these longer-term pro-social reinforcers, extended reinforcers, you know, have less and less value. And that's why I think you see people with addiction make choices, unfortunately because of our opioid epidemic, you can see numerous examples of that. You have people injecting street opioids knowing that there could be fentanyl on board, right? And they may know people that have died recently, but they're still doing it. That's a choice. I want to get high now, and I don't care what happens too much later, right, including my life. We hear stories about individuals stealing from their loved ones in order to support their habit, engaged in other risky behaviors, be it criminal or, support that habit. It shows that in a real sense, they're trapped by the tyranny of the small time frame. And what I think is exciting, and I see as the value of this new concept of reinforcement pathology, it gives us a new target, the temporal window, and it suggests that there might be new ways that we can engender greater consideration in the future. And if that continues to work out, and it may not, but if it does, it will give us a new tool in our treatments to think about how to get people to be in a better circumstance and not stuck in this small time frame.
Yeah, I think I'd just add that, there are cases, of course, where, going for the hedonistic lifestyle also is good as a long-term strategy. They're not the clinically interesting ones. The clinically problematic ones are where there's a conflict. And so I don't think it's necessarily that that they're always opposed.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I could imagine.
But when they are, then this is where interesting clinical problems arise.
I could imagine, in some forms of like day trading or other types of trading commodities where prices fluctuate quickly, right? Being able to respond quickly and be under the control of immediate probably leads to a very good career.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, thank you. I think we have actually a number of additional questions, but I think we're running short on time. So what we'll do is, for those of you who have not gotten your questions answered, we'll provide those to our speakers, and then we will send their answers back to you via email so that everyone can have their questions answered. So I think I'll turn it back over now. Thank you so much to Dr. Bickel and McClure, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Hunter.
Thanks. Just want to echo Dr. Zukowski's thanks, Drs. Bickel and McClure. It was really interesting, and I think hearing about the process of kind of engaging with these ideas and engaging with different disciplines was very stimulating and interesting. Thank you, Susan, for moderating, and thank you to all of us online for joining us. Just remind you that a recording of today's webinar will be available in about 1 month. And also want to remind you to mark your calendars for next month's webinar, which will be held on March 27th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Our guest speaker is Dr. Kenzie Cameron, Research Professor of Medicine, Medical Social Sciences, and Preventive Medicine at Northwestern University. And the title of that talk will be From Patient Perspectives to Preventive Care, Harnessing Technology to Improve Adult Pneumococcal Vaccination. And that's it for today. This concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and thank you for joining us.